Okay, so we talked about the first hot air balloon last week in one of our lectures. The important thing to remember there is that it was not only the first hot air balloon, but it was really in many ways the first flight of anything other than birds. I did notice on the internet that somebody claimed that back in the 1500s there were some people that built things that looked like airplanes and flew them, but you know, it's hard to verify something that's 500 years old. So the best thing that we can do now is to accept the fact that these gentlemen were the first people to fly a hot air balloon. And as I show there, the first poor passengers on board were the sheep, duck, and the rooster. Shortly thereafter, they put humans on board, and then they had many, many flights. And people in Paris and France in general loved the hot air balloon. They thought it was the ultimate flight. They never conceived that anything beyond that might be able to stay in the air. But they were definitely excited about the hot air balloons. Someone prior to that had paper bags, and they would put fires. They put fires on the ground underneath the paper bag, and they would watch the paper bag rise up. And it only goes so far, and then it would wind up stopping, right? The same in gliders. The way we fly gliders in a thermal is we get in a thermal, which is like a bubble of hot air. It's not a bubble, actually it's a column, but let's think about it as a bubble. The bubble of hot air that begins to rise because inside the bubble, the air is hotter than outside the bubble. And as long as that's the case, that bubble is going to continue to rise. And in many cases, I wound up landing at a plot field one day because the guy that I was flying with caught a thermal. He thought it was a thermal. I thought it was a thermal. He was just ahead of me about half a mile. And he said, "Harold, come over here. I've got a great thermal." So I went over and got underneath him. Nothing. It turned out to be that he was in a bubble, and he was just working the bubble all the way up. Because I had gone over to him rather than searching myself, I wound having to land in a field underneath some power lines, by the way. So hot air balloons are not necessarily a new invention. It's just that in your lifetime, when anyone decides to do something first, even though you say to yourself, "Well, I could have done that." Yeah, but you didn't, right? And that's really true of all these pioneers. This is sort of the first depiction of what it looked like to fly a hot air balloon. And that was in France. How about Pitot? Yeah, French word. Okay, so the next one is the first powered airship. Charles and Arthur, in 1884, took a balloon up. You know, they had thought about it for some time, and they thought, you know, instead of just going up in the air and then allowing the balloon to be blown around by the various currents, why don't we design something that will go on the basket of the balloon that will at least give us an option to go somewhere? So they did. They got an electric motor and a wooden propeller, and that was literally the first time there had ever been a powered airship. I flew the Goodyear blimp for half an hour, and that was pretty interesting because the Goodyear blimp, I took off from near Los Angeles International Airport, and I flew down to Long Beach, and I flew around the top of the Queen Mary, and that giant aircraft, the Hughes aircraft that was down there at one time. Well, the blimps generally go maybe 40 miles an hour maximum, and it takes them forever to maneuver those blimps around the country to be on top of sporting events. As you know, especially in football games are surrounded by blimps. They're either the Goodyear blimp or some manufacturer has the blimp circling around the field. They have big television cameras and long-range telescope kind of things, not telescope, long-range cameras that photograph the event. We occasionally see blimps going by Avenal on their way north, either to the Bay Area or all the way up to Seattle, but it takes them forever, and they have to be followed by a big convoy of trucks that help maneuver them when they start getting down near the landing. And the shocking thing for me was that when we took off, we got rid of the mooring line, and the guys on the ground let go, the climb angle was way greater than 45 degrees. It must have been in the vicinity of 55, almost 60-degree climb angle. And it just goes up, then it levels off, and then you fly it around, and then you go down the same way. It sticks the nose down, and it goes all the way down until the rope that's hanging on the nose of the airship or blimp, until the guys can grab it and start maneuvering it. They're awkward. They're very, very awkward. Very safe. I found the blimp, Goodyear Columbia blimp, to be very, very noisy. It has twin engines, and the engines are mounted on the back sides of the little passenger cabin. And boy, I don't think I could take that all day long. The noise and the vibration was really very disturbing. Okay, here's a picture of that first powered airship, and you can see that big wooden propeller there. Let's see if that works. There we go. There we go. There were some really interesting looking things back in those days. You can see the shape is beginning to take the shape of even the Goodyear blimp today. Doesn't look a lot different from that particular picture. What was that? Somebody talking? Were you asking a question? No? Okay. Wright brothers, powered flight. Remember that it wasn't the first aircraft to fly. There were aircraft before that. How about Otto Lilienthal, right? He had 2,000 flights in an aircraft. There were also a couple of powered attempts in aircraft. But the Wright brothers were the first ones to have powered, maneuverable, sustained, heavier than air. And maneuverable is the key, because they designed a way in which they could bank and turn the glider and the airplane, and they could maneuver it very carefully so they could follow a particular course if they wanted to. They could make circles, they could go around racetracks, they could dodge trees, they could do a lot of things with it. And the way they did it at the time was they warped the wings. They had control cables to the cockpit, and they warped the wings. Then along came Glenn Curtiss, and Curtiss designed an airplane with wings that had ailerons. So the Wright brothers were not necessarily the first people to use ailerons, but it was Glenn Curtiss and people after the Wright brothers. There was a real nasty legal battle between Glenn Curtiss and the Wright brothers. Wright brothers wanted to protect their patent. Glenn Curtiss was a real inventor also, so he took the airplane that Wright brothers had designed, and he made it much better. Then the Wright brothers said, well, we're going to sue you for patent infringement. Everybody familiar with patents? You know, there's some good things about patents and bad things, and a lot of companies like Apple, I'm sure, don't even file a patent. Does anybody know why not? Because when you file a patent, you have to disclose what it is. And a lot of corporations are not willing to disclose the secrets of their inventions to the whole world. Because anybody in the world can access the patent office in the United States, and you can get detailed copies of the blueprints that were submitted in order to be granted a patent. And normally patents only last 17 years. You can modify the patent significantly and get another 17 years. But still, one of the dangers of a patent is people get access to how clever you were in your design. Keep that in the back of your mind. Anyway, one of the things that the Wright brothers did first before anyone ever did it is they built a wind tunnel. Today, you couldn't even think about designing an airplane without a wind tunnel. If you didn't have a wind tunnel, you might as well forget it. You're not in the game of designing airplanes without a wind tunnel. Now, not everybody has a wind tunnel, but you can buy time on wind tunnels, and you can buy time on wind tunnels that are very large or very small, depending. Sometimes you have to put a scale model of your airplane or your wing or whatever it is you want to take a look at in the wind tunnel. You have to scale it down perfectly so that the data you get from it are significant enough. But if you designed a scale model and it wasn't exactly what your blueprint said and you put it in the wind tunnel, it doesn't make any difference what kind of data you get from it. It's not going to be worth anything. So that was really one of the real keys to future aviation was Wright brothers building their own wind tunnel. And there is the Wright brothers aircraft flying for the first time in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Now, is that something you should remember for the quiz? Yeah, sure. Why not? It's a momentous occasion. It is so important that every few years we honor things and that we honor them at Kitty Hawk. I had a good friend who flew a glider, not nonstop, but he flew a glider from Avenal to Kitty Hawk in celebration of the 100th anniversary of Wright brothers powered flight. That was back in 2003. And he along with a bunch of people, flew aircraft. He flew the glider all the way across the United States for the celebration of what happened at Kitty Hawk. What's even more fun is that the Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. has that aircraft hanging from the ceiling. So if you ever have an opportunity to go to Washington, either with your high school or with your parents or friends or somebody, make sure that even if you're not necessarily wildly interested in aviation, I can't think of a single person that went to the Air and Space Museum in Washington that didn't come out awestruck, just amazed at what that aviation museum has for you to look at in detail. And I'll show you another picture later on in the presentation of what I mean by the critically important things in aviation are either in the Space Museum in Washington or they've got a big display at the Space Museum. And it's on the mall. It's on the Capitol Mall. Okay, world's first commercial airliner. They called it the St. Petersburg Tampa Airboat Line. Everybody thinks that Qantas is the world's oldest airline, and that's not really true. In the letters Q, A, N, T, A, S. You'll see that those airlines, you'll see them on the internet, you'll see them in pictures. It's an Australian airline. It's the flagship airline of Australia. And it is really one of the first, I should say, major commercially scheduled airlines. And there are certain regions in Australia. Is everybody familiar with Australia? There are certain regions in Australia. One of them is the Northern Territory, right? That's one of the regions. There's another region called New South Wales. There's another one called something else. Anyway, and so this stands for Queensland, which is an aerial service. I mean, an area in Australia. Queensland, it's like a state in our United States, but they're really big. They're big chunks, not small states like we have. Queensland and Northern Territories Aerial Service. That's what Qantas stands for. So when you see a big Qantas jet airport somewhere, those letters represent Queensland, which is a territory in Australia, and the Northern Territories is another, and they're both side by side. So they used to fly from Queensland to Northern Territories and back again. And they called it Queensland and Northern Territories Aerial Service. And here's what that flying boat looked like. Apparently it didn't last long. But I have to tell you, in my experience, over my lifetime in aviation, there have been so many airlines that arose and died. When I had my Piper dealership, I sold 3 big Navajo chieftains to a company called Baja Cortez Airlines. They were going to be flying people from L.A. down into the Baja and back again. And they had beautiful aircraft. I know because I sold it to them. They had beautiful aircraft, and they had them painted beautifully. Should have put a picture up there. But they didn't last long. Maybe a year, maybe 2 years. The problem is that most people go into aviation to open up an airline because it's romantic. And they don't necessarily appreciate how to really make a profit out of aviation. But think of all the airlines that have gone out of business. Braniff went out of business. Eastern Airlines went out of business. TWA went out of business. Just so many good airlines that lasted a long time just ultimately go out of business. Either they're bought up and melded in with the major airline, or they simply go out of business because they can't make a profit. One of those funny things about the airline business that I don't quite understand why people get into it and then they don't pay any attention to profit. Okay, Charles Lindbergh. An amazing man. Anybody have any information about Charles Lindbergh? Is anybody going to be writing on the subject of Charles Lindbergh? So the interesting thing about it is he used to fly mail. He did a lot of other things, but one of the things he did is flew mail back and forth from Chicago to St. Louis. And the reason I'm interested is because I know that St. Louis can get fogged in because it's right on the Mississippi River. And when it gets fogged in, at the time that he was delivering mail, there was no way to make an instrument approach. Like today, we can go down through anything, right down to the point where the airplane lands itself in fog so thick you can't see your hand in front of your face. But at that time, there was no way to do that. So what he would do is he would spin the airplane. And everybody thinks that a spin is a terrible thing and you're going to die because now you've spun the airplane. But a spin is fairly mild. If you're the pilot and you know how to spin an airplane, it's fairly mild. There are no stresses on the airplane. You can time the number of turns. You don't even have to pay attention when you go through the cloud. You don't get disoriented because you're spinning. Come out the bottom of the cloud, and it only takes about 10 seconds for you to recover from the spin. So that's one of the things that he did. He sort of paved the way to deliver mail in areas where there was no way to get in if it was foggy. So the aircraft was built by Ryan Airlines in San Diego, and it was built primarily to his specifications. The same is true of the Wright Whirlwind engine. That engine was built again according to his standards, according to his request. He wanted a powerful engine, and he wanted an airplane that could handle the kind of turbulence he thought he might expect if he was going cross country. In this case, he was going across the ocean. He knew that he was going to take that airplane and do nothing with it except fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. First time anybody did it. There had been teams of people with multi-engine airplanes that made it across the Atlantic. So this was not the first time anybody had ever gone across the Atlantic in an aircraft, but it was the first solo, a single engine actually, first solo single engine flight across the Atlantic. Can you imagine sitting in an aircraft and with the kind of navigation equipment that he had at the time, can you imagine trying to figure out the winds that you're encountering, the weather systems, and to try to take advantage of the fact that you might be blown off course one way or the other? And you have to try to figure out how to account for it. But you can't tell, sitting in the airplane at, let's say, 2,000 or 3,000 feet, whether or not you're getting blown off course. There's a great movie. It's an old movie. It's a black and white movie, but it features Jimmy Stewart, and it is about the flight across the Atlantic. And that's really a wonderful movie. If you can get on Netflix, I'm sure Netflix or Amazon probably has a copy of the movie. But if anybody has a copy of the movie and you really have an interest in understanding the pressures that he was under, they do a really good job of depicting him in the cockpit droning his way across the North Atlantic. Imagine 33 hours and 30 minutes in the air. And he arrived in Paris almost at midnight. And there were so many people there, they started tearing things off the airplane, and they started tearing pieces off of him. They wanted pieces of his coat, his hat, his jacket. The cops finally had to intervene and keep people away because they were going to destroy the airplane. They did get pieces of fabric off the airplane. So the airplane that survived the day and came back on a ship is a patched-up airplane. So here's what the airplane looked like. Take a real good look at that cutaway view and then tell me what you see might be wrong with it. What might be different about that airplane compared to the airplanes that you know today? What is odd about it? Pardon? It is. What else? Pardon? Speak up. Say it loudly. Well, it's a high wing, right? Sort of like a Cessna today. Sort of like these Cessnas sitting out here. But, The what now? Oh, the wood frame wings. Yeah, well, there are lots of wood frame wings still flying today. You've got Piper Cubs that are flying. Those are wood wings. There are Arancas that are flying, wood wings. So it's not necessarily unusual. The windshield? Which one are you talking? Oh, the wind wheel for a generator? Yeah, that's interesting. What's really more important to me, and it won't dawn on you until you see it, is there's no windshield. He can't see forward. He has to stick his head out, but he also had a periscope. He had a periscope to look through. So he had to take off, get out over the Atlantic, fly, land in Paris without a windshield. He had to stick his head out the side of the window, either side. So that was the only way he could see. And here he's talking about the periscope happens to be retracted, but he can put it up and he can see with the periscope. But that's not a real good view. I mean, if you're thinking about a periscope back in era, it's probably not a real great periscope. So I told you about the Air and Space Museum in Washington, the Smithsonian. That's the actual Spirit of St. Louis airplane that he donated to the Smithsonian. That's the airplane, and you can get up on a catwalk or there's a second balcony where you can get fairly close to it. You can't touch it, obviously. It's probably 10 feet away, but 10 feet is close enough. You can be able to see all the detail of that. You can see no windshield here. The windows on either side that he had to look out. It's really a beautiful airplane, though. I just when you wander around the Smithsonian in Washington, you're walking through 100 or more years of history. I don't remember that they have the Montgolfier balloons, but maybe they do. I probably wasn't terribly interested in the balloons at the time. So the tragedy of Lindbergh is that because he was such a celebrity, two things happened to him that are not really great. Number one is for some reason or another, he sort of took a liking to Hitler. Anybody know who Hitler was? Right? That awful individual who, among other things, killed 6 million Jews, put them in the gas chambers. For some reason or another, Lindbergh sort of got connected with Hitler and the Nazis, and no one in the United States would ever excuse him for that. Yeah. And the what? He did what now? Heavily involved in. In aircraft. Hitler? Oh, yeah, yeah. But that never really came out in the kind of information that we've been getting about why Lindbergh was sort of not a champion, but he certainly did not denounce Hitler in spite of the fact that what was going on in Germany and Poland at the time was awful. So we don't know for sure what the interest was. I don't think that Lindbergh ever helped the Germans with their aircraft design. Germans by themselves were really great aircraft designers. And the other thing is that at the height of his celebrity, somebody kidnapped his baby and killed it. And that went on for months and months and months in the United States in the newspapers about where was Lindbergh's baby. And they finally caught the guy who kidnapped it. He was demanding, $10, $20 million, whatever, because he figured that Lindbergh was such a hero and such a celebrity that he had plenty of money. So that was really a sad event for the whole United States. He and his wife never got over that tragedy. He sort of turned into a recluse, a lot like Howard Hughes. Anybody familiar with Howard Hughes? Howard Hughes built the world's largest flying boat that used to be anchored down in Long Beach. It's now up in the Portland area. He was a recluse also. He made so many billions of dollars, and he all donated it all, but he became such a recluse that he sequestered himself inside a room in one of the hotels in Las Vegas that he happened to own, and he never came out. It's reported that his fingernails were growing so long that he could hardly do anything with his hands. He had a long beard. He turned into a real weirdo. But there are lots of things that exist today because of Howard Hughes, not the least of which the Hughes Medical Center, where he donated some of his billions to ensure that a medical center would be able to go on forever and not have to worry about money. Okay, breaking the sound barrier. I was alive during that period of time. I was not real old. I was 11 years old. But I remember out near Edwards Air Force Base, there was a tavern, and a lot of the test pilots used to meet in that tavern in the morning or in the afternoon, and they would have a lot of beers. They'd also ride horses. So Chuck Yeager knew he was scheduled for the ride in the Bell X-1. So he was out riding horses with a friend, and the horse threw him, and he wound up on the ground with a couple of broken ribs. And if you have a broken rib, I had one, but I understand extremely painful to have a broken rib. And so when he climbed into the Bell, see the mothership was a B-29, and they hung the Bell underneath the B-29, and Chuck Yeager rode in the mothership until they got up to altitude. I don't remember what, 45,000 feet or something like that. He rode in there, and then he climbed down through a hatch in the B-29 and into the hatch of the Bell X-1. But there were a couple of things he had to do. He had to close the hatch really tightly, and he couldn't do it because he was so well pained by the broken ribs. He brought with him a piece of a broom handle, and he used the broom handle to help him close the hatch door on the Bell X-1 when he got in and got comfortable. So Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier. Now, today we don't even think twice about the sound barrier, right? But at the time, you can't even imagine how many people were saying, well, when you get to that sound barrier, things will explode. They'll just disintegrate. And other people were saying, we don't know what's on the other side of that barrier. And if I were you, I don't know. I don't think I'd be one to fly and try to break the sound barrier. There were all kinds of theories how bad it was going to be on the other side of the sound barrier. Now, Chuck Yeager found out differently, right? By the time he got to the sound barrier, all of a sudden it was quiet. He just sort of moved, a little bit of turbulence, and moved through the sound barrier, and now the sound was behind him. So whatever he was doing wasn't reaching him. It was being heard behind him. So if you've ever heard a big boom on the ground, and it wasn't some factory that exploded, it was probably a jet overhead breaking the sound barrier. Because sometimes sometimes the guys from Lemoore get a little goofy, and they take those F-18s and they purposely break the sound barrier. Now, of course, if anybody finds out who did it, they probably would wind up getting some discipline when they get back to Lemoore. But generally speaking, breaking a sound barrier drags a boom all the way across the country. That's one of the reasons why the Concorde, which was a British-French supersonic airliner, was never really going to be successful, because no one would allow that to fly supersonically across the United States, because every inch of property along that path, you'd hear this tremendous boom, and sometimes it was so strong that it would break windows in homes as it went overhead. So the sound barrier was a unique point in time in life. Chuck Yeager loved it. He's a great guy. He was a superb pilot on his own, a superb fighter pilot, a superb test pilot. And Edwards Air Force, I used to live right near Edwards Air Force, and so I had an opportunity to be involved with a lot of the people who work there and all the people who were test pilots at Edwards Air Force Base. If you ever have a chance to go to an open house at Edwards Air Force Base, take it, because so many really great things have been happening at Edwards Air Force Base in the area of aviation. A lot of high-level research. They have runways so long that you can practically not even see one end from the other. So here's what the Bell X-1 looked like. In fact, it's in existence, and I believe it's also at this Smithsonian. I'm pretty sure it's at Smithsonian. It's just a small little aircraft with mostly rocket fuel. So he sits in here, and the rocket engine's back here, and I believe they had the fuel coming from here, or they had mostly the fuel, just like a rocket, where it has solid fuel. So when he lit the fire, it just took off, and he went as fast as he could go. He kept going and going and going. When he got to Mach 1.0, he realized that he had finally made it. Mach numbers are the speed of sound at sea level, because the speed of sound varies when you go up in altitude. So a commercial airliner would be flying at 0.85 Mach. Most of them fly at 0.85 Mach, which means they're flying at 85% of the speed of sound. But then when they're at altitude, that's about 700 and some feet, 700 miles an hour, as opposed to down on the ground, Mach 1 would be maybe 625 miles an hour. So what you're getting in terms of speed and up in the air where it's thin is different from what you get on the ground where the air is thick. So there's the mothership. It was a B-29, and it was designed to hang that Bell X-1 underneath it. It actually hung underneath a wing. And there was a hatch that was carved in the bottom, and he would climb through the wing and down into that hatch and then down into the Bell X-1. And then, of course, when everybody was ready, the people in the people in the B-29 are the ones that released him. He did not have the release off the B-29. It was people in the B-29. And once he was there, then he just took off. So that was a really momentous time in aviation history. It was breaking the sound barrier just because everybody worried about what was going to happen on the other side of the barrier. Okay, first man in space. A Russian. (1961). Where was I in 60? I was in college in 61. I remember that. It was so in the United States that it shocked them. They never expected, nor did anybody have any advance information on the fact that they were going to be able to put it in space. Yes, they did put a satellite in space, and that satellite circled the Earth beeping. But no one thought that the Russians had enough technical knowledge to be able to put a man in space and then retrieve him successfully. And at that time, the Vostok 1 rocket was really crude. In fact, the Russians are known for big, heavy, powerful, but crude kinds of rocket equipment. But you'll notice that we still use the Russians to get us up to the space station. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Our complexity sometimes works against us. They are not complex. They are really fundamental aircraft. They don't try to get too fancy. They just design something so it works. And it's almost bulletproof. And because no one had ever gone into space before, no one... But again, the dates are important, aren't they? And they're important because they give you a milestone of the development of aviation from the Montgolfier brothers balloon in 1783 until here today. So by the time I end this presentation, we will be sort of current where we are today. But that's what that little capsule looked like. So here's a guy who was willing to sit in a bubble. Here's a guy that was willing to sit in a bubble and be rocketed into space. And even today, the astronauts will tell you that that first liftoff out of Cape Canaveral is really a jarring experience. The vibration and the noise is horrendous. Here's Yuri Gagarin sitting there. The only one he can see is something down here, and he's got a little porthole right there. But otherwise, if anybody was claustrophobic, they certainly wouldn't be able to survive where he did. And so, again, he turned out to be a hero. And, well, he should be a hero. It's almost like Neil Armstrong on the moon, right? Yuri is a Neil Armstrong of the Soviet Union. They have things named for him everywhere. There are plazas, there are statues, streets named after him, schools named after him. And that's the Vostok 1 rocket. And you can see it doesn't really resemble much of what we have in the United States. It's again, they are crude designers but effective. Of designing things that work, although they may not be complex and they may not be real fancy. First man on the moon. A good question on the quiz would be, how many days did it take him to get from Cape Canaveral? It was called Cape Kennedy at the time. They have since renamed it. But to go from Cape Canaveral to stepping on the moon. Interested in how my computer company was going to be doing, But at the same time, everything in the United States and then everybody stopped television. It was everybody so anxious, nervous, and scared and worried. Then they had a lunar module that broke away from the main capsule, and it went down to the moon. That little module blasted off from the moon and went back up and connected with the main capsule, and then that came back to the States. And boy, even with the moon, less recognizes that the module. When does the lunar module break away from the main command module? When does it go down? Where does it land? It comes back through the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is thick insulating tiles that line the bottom of the bottom area there. And if you've ever seen pictures of a re-entry, the flames that come by the side of the windows of the module are just amazing. Station Salute 1. The accidents that they're referring to, re-entry, as it says there, and what that means is that the United States had sophisticated electronics to be able to pinpoint a landing, and they did it in the ocean. The Russians weren't quite as developed in their sophistication. As I mentioned earlier, they were crude but great when it came to bulletproof rockets. They could design a rocket twice as powerful, and it wouldn't do much, but it would get up there and it would come back down again. Well, what the Russians did was, instead of landing in the ocean, because they didn't really have an ocean near Moscow or near the Kamchatka Peninsula, yeah, but anyway, where their cosmodrome was, so they brought the men back and landed them on the ground. And when you do that, you really are risking a lot of problems. Exactly how well you can pinpoint. And they were never really good at pinpointing how perfectly they could determine where that landing was going to be. So it could hit a mountain, it could hit a valley, it could hit a river. They just never knew for sure. So that was the big difference between the Russians and the United States. We had the sophistication of bringing them back. They didn't have that much sophistication. So there were some deaths. And also, they didn't have quite the sophistication of getting tiles enough to avoid the re-entry, the burning up of the re-entry. That was another thing that they encountered. So it was, we were happy to see them get back safely, some of them, but the United States knew that without sharing that with the Russians, and we didn't. There may have been spies in the United States that sent that information, but for a long time they were not quite very good. They weren't very good at getting their astronauts back to Earth safely. 175 days in space, and they couldn't keep it up long enough. They just didn't have the onboard kind of little motors and jets that we have in order to keep a space station in orbit. Because if you don't do anything with a space station, it ultimately degrades. It degrades and it comes back again. There are only a couple of spots where there's such perfect positioning that if you get something in those spots, I forget what it's called, maybe somebody in here knows, it'll stay up there forever. But that's not the case where we were putting men and the shuttles in orbit. We were putting them in orbit that were close enough to the Earth to do some good, but not so far away that it would take a lot more complexity to get them back in. So the first space station didn't survive. The space station that's up there now is so sophisticated that it automatically keeps itself in perfect orbit. It senses whether or not it's in the right orbit, and then it moves these little maneuvering rocket, little jets. They use hydrazine, I believe is the name of the gas they use. They use hydrazine as a fuel, and these little jets are mounted around the space station. So if they wanted to maneuver it this way, they would use this little jet to push out a little hydrazine, and it moves the space station side to side or front to back. But proved to the world, number one, that they could do it, but they proved to the world that being in space for any length of time was not a terrible thing medically. Again, everybody was worried about what happens when you go into space and you spend 6 months in space. What happens to your body? Well, if you don't do anything, your body deteriorates. Your muscles get eaten away. You wind up almost being a paraplegic when you come back. If you spent 6 months in space and didn't do any exercise and didn't do the kinds of things that the astronauts have to do today, you would come back and you would be so weak, it would take you months to recover your original strength as a result of being in space. Also, things happen to your bone. Your bones start getting a little weaker. For some reason or another, the growth of bones isn't as healthy and as medically good as it would be if you were on Earth. That's what the Russian space station looked like. Again, it didn't last long. It wound up in re-entry. That's what it looked like. And you can see that that compared to the space station today, I think the space station today has about 10 or 20 times more room in it than that did at the time. But again, it was okay. It was satisfactory. It gave all the world the information it needed to be able to build another space station and put it up there. But when we built ours in modules, and we kept taking them up with the space shuttle and taking them up. And so now the space station that's up there is called the International Space Station, and it is huge. They have room for exercise rooms, they have bedrooms, they have working rooms, they have command rooms. It's really pretty amazing. Space shuttle. That's something you all should be familiar with, right? The space shuttle hasn't been shut down so many years that you wouldn't remember at least a little bit about it. If you go to Washington, D.C., you can see a space shuttle, one of the ones they retired. It's in the Air and Space Museum, not on the Washington Mall, but at Dulles International Airport. So if you ever had a chance to go to Washington, try to get to both of those museums, the one on the Washington Mall and the one at Dulles International Airport. So in a few short years, we've gone from the Wright brothers in 1903, shuttle in 1981. You could even say until stepping on the moon in 1969. I can hardly think of another industry that has come so far, so fast, and so well developed as the aviation industry. Now, with anything else, when you're the first to do things, it really puts a tremendous burden on you because you are likely to understand that there will probably be a few tragedies along the way. But in 30 years, they only had 2. And both of those probably could have been avoided. The original Columbia that took off in 1981 from Cape Canaveral, Cape Kennedy, I guess they call it, Cape Kennedy, ultimately wound up burning up in the atmosphere on its way back in. And you guys, anybody ever heard about the Challenger accident? The Challenger accident was awful because there were engineers that said, don't take off, the weather is too cold, the O-rings that keep the 2 parts of the rocket together, those O-rings are not going to work in cold weather. People at NASA go ahead and launch it anyway. You could see the burning coming out the side of the rocket. It was already burning. From Cape Canaveral in Florida now. At the time, they had renamed it Kennedy. And the reason it's breaking up is because there were a couple of, when it took off at Cape Kennedy, a big chunk of frozen ice fell off the top. See, when you fuel a rocket, you're fueling it with very, very cold liquid fuel, right? So the rocket is both liquid fuel and solid fuel. But the liquid fuel, the outside of the rocket, tends to have ice collect on it because of how cold it is inside and how much moisture there is on the outside. And a big chunk of insulation that was on there to keep the ice from forming, they were worried about the ice. Well, it's the insulation. Big piece fell off, and as it fell, and the rocket's going up, it hit the wing, the leading edge of the wing of the shuttle. And when it did, it put a little bit of a dent in the leading edge of the wing. But nobody for sure knew that that was the case, and so it kept going, right? So now they're in orbit. Somebody said, you know, I think what we should do is we should take a real close look at the leading edge of that wing, and the Air Force has some top secret telescopes that are so powerful that from the ground they could take a look right up to the edge of the wing. They could spot the edge of the wing to see if there was any damage. That's how, and of course these things are top secret. Nobody talks about it. They don't want to talk about it because we use those, you know, we use those in ways that give us intelligence as to what the rest of the world is doing. So wouldn't you think that somebody would say, okay, go ahead and do it? No. No, they said, no, we're not going to do it. The Air Force would say, wait a minute, we're ready to do it. We'll no, it's okay. We're pretty sure that it didn't do any harm. Well, on re-entry, that little dent had a tiny little hole in it that they didn't know about. And so the re-entry burning gases got inside the wing, and when they got inside the leading edge of the wing of the shuttle, it started burning up. And that's what you see there. Those are pieces of the shuttle breaking apart as a result of the re-entry. They found those pieces all over Texas, Louisiana, on into Alabama. They sent out search teams all over the southern United States, beginning with New Mexico, because they realized that it was probably over New Mexico when it first started breaking up. But by the time it broke up completely, it was already into Louisiana, the Louisiana area. It was coming in California coast. So there were photographers in California that had good high resolution lenses on their cameras that began taking pictures, and they were saying, you know, there's something wrong. It looks like there's some pieces coming off. Oh, no, there are pieces coming off. Don't worry about it. Well, of course, they captured pictures. And I'm not sure who actually took this picture, but I know that there were amateur cameramen in California that took some really great pictures of the Columbia as it was breaking up, coming across the United States. Again, one of those things of the culture of NASA at the time was, we're okay, no big deal. We're arrogant. Nothing's ever going to happen. Now, why do I bring this up? It's because one of the things you're going to discover if you stay in aviation is that there are 4 or 5 things that you never want to do as a pilot. And one of them is be arrogant enough to say it's not going to happen to you. And you'll see this. It'll be taught to you later on that there are certain mental orientations, certain attitudes that you cannot afford to have as a pilot. And one of them is the attitude that NASA displayed when they said about the Challenger, oh, don't worry about it. You know, that old ring is okay, fire it off. Or here, no, we don't want to have it photographed. We're sure that there was no damage to the wing of the shuttle. There's a saying, the word bold, B-O-L-D, is defined in your dictionary as fearless in the face of danger. Okay, that's what bold means, fearless in the face of danger. So there's a saying, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. Which means that if you want to be bold, you probably are not going to reach an old age. If you want to be old, you better not be a bold pilot taking stupid chances in aviation because of where you're going to wind up. So remember, there are old pilots and there are bold pilots, but there are no old, bold pilots. And boy, the longer you're in aviation, the longer you're going to remember that. I had a glider flight one time. I'll tell you about my stupid flight. I was taking a woman on a demo flight, and we had launched in the glider, and I was on tow behind the tow plane, and we were in the mountains. And we had already gotten over one ridge, so I couldn't see the airport. and we were a little bit lower than this ridge here. And all of a sudden, boom, and I thought, wow, was that a great thermal. So I immediately released the glider and got it turned around and went back, and I couldn't find the thermal. Now I'm in a terrible area. The canyons, the walls of these ridges are very steep, filled with trees and boulders and rocks. I'm below the ridgeline. At that moment in time, I thought I was done for. I thought that I had put myself in a position where I was going to die, and so was the one that paid $199 for a demo ride, and she is that in a moment, you're going to be in a terrible, terrible accident. Fortunately, that was stupid. Fortunately, my training came into effect in gliders, and so when I turned back to the ridgeline, over on the other side of which was the airport, I dove down. And if you think about it, you say to yourself, why in the world would you get lower? You need to get up over that ridgeline. Well, in gliders, if you are put in a position of danger where you're not going to make something, your best friend is speed. So I dove at this side of the ridge, and right at the time where it was going to hit a tree, I yanked back on the glider, and the extra kinetic energy, right? I used the kinetic energy of the extra speed to gain potential energy to get up, and I just barely made it over the ridgeline. I don't know what I was thinking. I probably was at that point in time. That woman was reacting. Oh, thanks. That was a wonderful ride. She gets out now. She's through these fields all ready to get back to the airport. She didn't say a word. She thought that was a planned flight. She thought I was doing what I was supposed to be doing. And she had a great time. Meanwhile, I'm going, yeah, she had to walk through fields to go through to get back to the airport, because when you get over the top of the ridgeline on a training glider, you cannot make it back to the airport. And I knew that. But all I wanted to do was save my life and her life by getting over that ridgeline. I didn't care where we landed after that. So, in that case, I was not quite bold enough to die as a result. So that's why I'm an old pilot rather than an old, bold pilot. Okay, now questions. Let's talk about the essay, because that's coming up next week. Remember, think about discussing your issue with your friends. And even if you take your iPhone and you turn on your recorder of your iPhone, iPhones don't they have recorder? Yeah. So you turn on the recorder of your iPhone and you talk to somebody. Nico talks to Jacob, right? You guys talk to one another, or talk to your mother or your father or your brothers and sisters, and describe to them what it is you're going to be doing for your essay. I will guarantee you'll get so much information, you'll have to cut it down in order to submit the amount of information that we're requesting as an essay. It's the idea that you're speaking relaxed, you're not writing, you're getting those ideas out as fresh as they come into your mind. You're not worried about whether or not you can write properly, or whether you start with a certain sentence, or whether you put a period in a sentence. So the whole idea is start talking to someone and put on your recorder and record what it is you're saying to them, and I guarantee you will have enough information, plenty of information. Nico. Pardon? The reference is where you got the information from, right? Whether it's on the internet, whether it's in a book or a magazine, but you need to give me a reference for an idea that you picked up somewhere. Okay, I can't let you go yet. I've been told that I need to keep you up right up till nearly 3 o'clock. So, you have any questions? Certainly by now, yeah. Pardon? It should be identified in there. Isn't it 5 paragraphs? Yeah. Introduction, and then, right? And then the conclusions, and then 3 paragraphs in the middle. If you try to write everything that you talked about with your friend about your idea, you'll find yourself writing or typing way more than you can possibly put in a paper. So the idea is by the time you get done talking to your friends about your idea on your essay, you're going to have to cut it down. That's how easy it is to be fluent when you're talking and not to be fluent when you're writing. The act of writing is you've got to write. Like anything else, if you want to be good at something, you've got to do it time and time again. Just like drawing. Anybody an artist in here? Any of you have any good art skills? No? Nobody an artist? Yeah. You do? You like to draw? Anybody else have any art skills? No? You guys are all just geniuses, right? I mean, you have mental skills that will blow everybody away, right? Oh, well, that's good. It's okay to be Einstein. Einstein was a great guy, by the way. Does anybody have any information about Einstein? Here's what he said. I'm going to tell you the theory of relativity. If you ever hear those words and somebody asks you what it is, you get blown away because nobody can really understand it very carefully. But here's what he said. This is called the special theory of relativity. He said the laws of physics are the same in all frames of reference in uniform motion. The laws of physics are the same in all frames of reference in uniform motion. What that means is this. If you're inside an airliner and you have a ping pong table set up inside the airliner, playing ping pong, you're not going to know whether you're in an airliner at 600 miles an hour or whether you're on the ground. Because the ball bounces the same in the airliner as it would on the ground. But if the airliner starts turning, that might be a different story, right? Because you have some little G-forces or whatever. It took him 9 years. It took him 9 years later to formulate the general theory of relativity. And he said, the laws of physics are the same in all frames of reference, period. Is that something I should be aware of? You're having a conversation? Okay. So if anybody ever asks you, be able to describe to them what the general theory of general relativity is, it's that simple. The special is in uniform motion. The general is he got rid of the restriction of being in uniform motion. So now any motion and the laws of physics are the same in all frames of reference, no matter what. But the first time it was in uniform motion. Because he was thinking about railroad trains going back and forth, going around curves. He was thinking about airplanes flying. He was thinking about a lot of things that might affect, like a ping pong game inside a moving aircraft or inside a moving train. But then finally, after 9 years and a little help from a mathematician, he was not a great mathematician, by the way. His thinking was so unique that he came up with the theory of relativity, and no one had ever even thought of that before. He also said that light bends, that you can bend light. And then 20 or 30 years later, they were able to prove it because when there was an eclipse of the sun, they could see the light from a distant star gets bent around the sun. And they were able to show, in fact, that the light does get bent when it's in the vicinity of strong gravitational forces. He was an amazing guy. His brain was just... Then the problem is when quantum mechanics came along, he resisted listening to the people who believed in quantum mechanics because quantum mechanics is really weird. So if you guys have ever taken any physics courses and you get discussing quantum mechanics, it's hard to get your brain around quantum mechanics because of the weird properties. So he rebelled against that. He said, I don't think that's really true. I don't think God plays dice with the universe. I don't think those things can happen. So here he was early on coming up with relativity and blowing everybody's mind. And now somebody else comes up with quantum mechanics and he can't accept it. He was kind of an interesting guy. Okay. Class dismissed. See you guys. Tomorrow we're probably going to do painting on the rockets, and if we have time, we may even go out and fire them. Okay. Thank you, sir. hold on one second.